Welcome to the future of work with our focus on the future of independent workers. And we're trying to solve the question over the course of this series, what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead? I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, driving the series here. We've got with us Natalie Foster today. And Natalie has got many different hats, but she is a co-chair of the Economic Security Project, a relatively new project that's actually working on many ways to look at universal basic income. She also really helped launch the Aspen Institute Future Work Initiative. She's continues to be a fellow there. She's been immersed in the future of the sharing economy, but also the future of work issues now for many years. We're really happy to have her in the studio here in San Francisco.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So why not, given that I just mentioned this Economic Security Project, one of the things that we're really trying to focus on here in this project, among many things, is the economic security issues for a lot of these independent workers, whether it's high-end contract workers, gig workers, temp workers, is one of the central issues here. So when I see Economic Security Project, I think, tell us more about what you're doing there.
Yeah, well, I think that, if you take a step back, I think that you are asking one of the most important questions. What do we do about the rise of independent work when we've built an entire system that supports people who work 9-to-5 traditional jobs, the type of jobs that had a pension and they had a safety net, and then you retired with a gold watch. Those jobs are disappearing. And they've been disappearing long before the on-demand economy or the sharing economy, which is what I think has put a lot of media spotlight on this particular kind of work. But we've seen growth of alternative work prior to that. Mm-hmm. And all of that happens outside of the benefits and protections that we as society built over the last industrial revolution that frankly built the middle class. They made sure that there was stability if you fell through, if you were unemployed, if you got hurt on the job, disability was there. There were, a bunch of protections built in, all of which independent workers don't have. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important we figure out the safety net questions, as well as questions of, collective power, like the union question, essentially, like what will unions look like in the future with this workforce, as well as the economic instability of the work. Because it's true that while a lot of the upside of an alternative work arrangement is that you're your own boss, that you have flexibility in your schedule, often you can determine what you charge. Sometimes you cannot. It just depends on where in the alternative work category you fall. Mm-hmm. The downsides are that it is quite unstable, and that you really don't always know when the paychecks are coming. Or there's wage theft, where it's not, you don't get paid, even though you sent the invoice in, which is something that the Freelancers Union have tried to tackle in New York, and have passed a groundbreaking bill on wage theft for independent contractors. So there's a number of things that we'll have to figure out from a policy perspective, but first we have to agree it's a problem. And that's one of the places where I think finally we're getting there, with some of the numbers that have come out recently saying that, while the on-demand economy, thinking Uber, Lyft, Postmates, Instacart, that's still quite small. The broader category of alternative work is very large. That the GAO says it's about 40% of the American workforce has some form of alternative work. So that's temporary work, contractors, people that a temp agency contracts through, as well as independent contractors and the self-employed. So it's a big, broad category, but it's all people who generally work without protections, benefits, and the stability that we built into the workforce, over the last 100 years.
So when I look at that, and we've been talking to other folks as well, so there was this system built, as you say, particularly in the post-war kind of second half of the 20th century, although built on some of the early stuff in the early 20th century. And maybe around the 80s it seemed to start changing in terms of the temp phenomena, which it was more low-end folks, and the contracting phenomena, which is more high-end folks. And this gig thing, I guess you could say, maybe the last, 10 years or so, however you think about that. So,
well, actually, like maybe 7 or 8 years, really, for the thing. Because the only reason I say that is because when we passed the Affordable Care Act, in 2009, which I'm very proud of. It was a highlight of the work I've been able to do over the last 15 years. We didn't think of it as a future of work policy. We thought of it as offering health insurance to the uninsured, who were uninsured for reasons we were not talking that much about. Like, we weren't talking about employers as a primary, that being a complicated way to be the only way to receive health insurance. And I now know that the Affordable Care Act was actually the first future of work policy in that it meant anyone could access health insurance regardless of their employment status. Now, there's still a lot of work to do to make it affordable and make it available, in all the states. But I didn't have to have a boss who had a benefits plan for me in order to get health insurance for the first time.
So when you say we, I know you were involved in the Obama campaign at one point. Were you involved in government? I didn't even know that. But so say more though about literally no one was thinking about future work issues there. That there's all these categories of work.
Well, I say that because Uber was not Uber driver was not a job that one could have yet. It was still to be something figured out in San Francisco, shortly thereafter. So my only point is it's actually very recent that the gig economy, I think, has put a spotlight on the long-standing disadvantages of independent contracting. And I, for one, think even though those long-standing disadvantages, whether if you're a nanny, if you're a gardener, you've always been, in the informal economy. Right. Even though Uber drivers we're not the first independent contractors that we should be worried about, it is a political opportunity for us to address these challenges. And that's why I think you're starting to see policy move in cities and states, and hopefully, ultimately, federally, that will address the entire swath of challenging independent contracting work.
Okay, so we're going to talk about, because you've got such a good perspective on this, we can go over a bunch of them. So with the Aspen Institute, you were working on a broader way of thinking about this as opposed to your more recent work here on universal basic income. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah.
So for people that are trying to wrestle around this, and actually we're finding part of the audience for this series is trying to just, understand what's even available out there, different government people don't even really know, what are we trying to wrestle with here? So is there a way you could just kind of give an overview of the landscape of kind of things out there that we need to be wrestling with, or kind of new ideas of kind of ways to approach some of these the 21st century versions of those 20th century kind of old institutions? How can you give us a little overview of that?
Yeah. So one place I think is really interesting is this conversation around perhaps benefits and protections should live with the worker and not be administered solely through the employer. So imagine you're an independent contractor, you have a benefits and protections account, just call it a benefits account, that moves with you throughout your work life. It moves with you as you change jobs, and it moves with you if you are in a gig situation where you're pulling in multiple income streams. And it's prorated, so that if you do 6 hours of work here, that you also have 6 hours worth of contributions to your benefits account. Or if you do 12 hours here, another 12 hours worth of contributions, that it needn't be all or nothing in the way the system we built for the last industrial revolution was. You had one employer, you had to work 40 hours a week in order to receive a full suite of benefits and protections. It needn't be all or nothing. Why not be able to prorate, my unemployment insurance, my workers' comp, or my paid time off, or my parental leave, and make it so that anyone who works in any way in which they work also has a safety net. It's often called portable benefits is sort of the shorthand for the idea. We kicked it off with the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative about a year and a half ago with a big conversation with lots of folks who'd been involved in the idea. David Rolfe up in Seattle, a bunch of companies who supported it, Lyft, Instacart, Etsy, Handy, Care.com, all CEOs signed onto a set of design principles, as well as labor leaders like David Rolfe, Palak Shah, and Aijin Poo of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Saket Soni, who has recently launched the Independent Workers Guild, the Indie Workers Guild, which my former organization peers that we got to talk about, I think a year or two ago, merged into to be the future, one of the hopefully answers of to this question of independent work. So all those folks came together to say there's something here that we should be looking at, which is how do we build the safety net, for the future. And since then, I've written a long policy document for policymakers on questions that they'll need to answer around portable benefits, who receives it, who pays, what benefits are we talking about. And we're really excited to see legislation in 2 states in the last few months. So Washington State and New Jersey both have examples, sort of prototype legislation that they're moving through the states as well. So
there's the policy kind of innovations that can work at a federal. I mean, when I first heard you talking, I was thinking, okay, that's a federal thing. But you're saying it could work on the state. Could it even on local levels? I mean, are these kind of?
So ultimately, we think it has to be a federal solution.
Yes, exactly.
That nobody wants a patchwork of different regulations around cities and states.
Right.
And frankly, the city and state question even gets complicated with jurisdiction. I left in a Lyft this morning from Oakland and arrived here in San Francisco. If San Francisco passes a law, does that driver, actually receive the contributions to his benefit account? Are the kinds of questions we'd like to avoid. But at this moment in time, states and cities are the laboratories of democracy. And that is absolutely where we'll prototype what this looks like. So we're really excited to see New Jersey and Washington State moving versions of this forward.
So there's policy innovation, but when I heard you talk about the benefits package work moving, is there like tech innovation? Not that it's rocket science, but is there systems that have to be built, or technologies or platforms that there's some opportunities there to kind of build and prototype that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. I think there has been innovation in this space in the last few years. I think Intuit actually has a bunch of great products out. Even is a product that helps independent contractors have a much more even income stream. So the way it works is you feed all of your different gig paychecks into it. You set a target for where you want to be. If you make above that, then it invests that money into your bank account. If you make below that, it actually loans you the money to get through that week or month. So it helps approximate a more steady income stream. There are other products out there that do similar things. Stride Health is a navigator for the health insurance marketplace exchange, but also has its eye on other products for independent contractors. The problem is right now that it's all a voluntary patchwork that the low-wage worker is somehow supposed to opt into, and then spend money to pay for. And I don't think that should be the future of the social safety net. I don't think it's viable. We know people won't do it. They would much rather have the take-home pay for the here and now, for the bills they have to cover right now, for the childcare they have to cover right now. And it's hard when you're in the paycheck-to-paycheck scenario to actually plan for the future. And there's a reason why we take certain things out of paychecks so that we can build the pool of unemployment insurance so that nobody needs unemployment insurance until they need it. And so I think it's a real balancing act of how we do this for the 21st century. But tech will absolutely play a role. I just think tech can't do it without policy. There has to be laws passed that say these are the new rules of work. This is how work has to look, and here's who's responsible for paying. And then when the rules are established, I think tech will play a very important role in making sure that the accounts are easy to access, that the money, that we have real-time payments flowing into accounts, the things that Uber and Lyft have already started to pioneer as platforms. I think we can see within benefits packages.
So your kind of theory of change is, just to kind of extrapolate what you're saying there, is yes, there's tech innovations, but given that they're voluntary, they're one piece. There needs to be some kind of pilots that prove how you can kind of do it, and maybe at scale from local to state. But then ultimately, the system won't work unless you lock into some new rules that really push through.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's been proven. I mean, if we're dealing with high-end, highly paid computer engineers who are freelancers, that's one thing. they have more time and space to actually be these, essentially an independent contractor is a small business. They have the tax liability of a small business. They have to think of the marketing in the same way a small business does. And have to kind of set up the processes, which not everyone can do. It takes a lot of energy and time. And so the lower down on the pay scale you get, the more people are simply trying to make ends meet, and it's very hard to. It's not a good future to imagine everybody's in it for themselves, and they just have to figure it out for themselves, or they could be in trouble if a big bill, came down. A surprising bill came down the line. So all that to say, I think it does have to be policy, and it does have to be policy too, so that we can establish who actually is responsible for paying for this. I don't believe it should be the person who makes $10 an hour or $12 an hour or even $15 an hour paying out of their own pocket. For an entire century, it's clear that it was the company who was making the majority of the profits, who helped cover the cost, who covered the cost of benefits and covered a lot of the cost of protection. And so we have to figure out what is that for the 21st century, when employment looks different, when the firm looks different, when it's not clear who the employer is. And those are some of the answers that I think these policy prototypes will start to get at the state and city level.
One other just kind of structural thing there, which is interesting that you raised, I just want to tease it out more clearly. So you envision that the ultimate payments for systems like this should come at the point where the company or platform or whoever who's essentially making money on the spot there should somehow put in, rather than ultimately some kind of income tax thing that funds a government thing that would essentially underwrite a redistribution.
That's a great question.
Is that the way?
I think both are viable. Okay. I think right now, we have two models on the books that have the platforms kicking in money for the benefits account. So one model is what's happening in Washington State and New Jersey, which would require platforms pay somewhere between a 20 and 25% contribution into a benefits account on top of the transaction. The other is actually on the books in New York, and I think it's a really interesting model to look at. It's the Black Car Fund in New York. It was established long before Lyft and Uber were around for black cars, and it requires limos, cabs, taxis were part of this. It requires that 2.5% of every ride go into a fund for the driver that provides workers' comps for the drivers. And earlier this year, when the on-demand platforms were extended into the entire state of New York, they were only operating inside New York City up until this year. They also extended the Black Car Fund. So now it is a statewide policy that ensures that no matter what sort of employment status you have as you drive, that you have workers' compensation, which means if you were hurt or if something happened to you on the job, that this would kick in and cover you. It's a very basic protection. I think everyone would agree on both sides of the aisle. It's a very important protection for workers, and it's really not clear how an independent contractor gets it. So I think the Black Car Fund is a really good model for what it could look like in other states and what you could do to extend it to other benefits
so
and
at
protections.
the point of the transaction, there's just a slice goes into it.
And honestly, I bet most New York consumers have no idea they're paying it.
That's interesting. Although it's somehow itemized, you could know what it is somehow.
I'm sure it's itemized on the receipt you get, but 2.5% is a small amount, but added up overall actually is quite substantive and has been successful in making sure most workers' comp claims are covered.
But one thing I did want to mention to this, because again, we're dealing with both the policy side and then also the tech side many times and company side. Is your impression that the tech companies who are these new innovative companies and they're trying to create these new markets and new technologies and go forward,
are they open, in your opinion, to innovations like that and kind of doing the right thing, or let's think through how do we make a system that works for the workers, or do you feel like they're more resistant in ways that kind of traditionally business has been to almost anything around these lines?
So we in my conversations with the companies, they're very interested in this particular solution. They know that the vulnerability of their workforce leads to the churn on their platform, leads to people dropping out for a few weeks because something happened to their car and they couldn't fix it. Things that are not good for their own marketplace. And I think that they also understand that the future policy has to protect all kinds of work. Now, we need them to put their money where their mouth is, for sure, but there's been some positive signs. So one was the letter I referenced earlier that a number of CEOs signed on to, alongside a number of labor leaders and thought leaders from both sides of the aisle, saying, we believe a portable, prorated, and universal safety net is a path forward that we all want to explore. Since then, I think Uber has done some really interesting, innovative work in this area. One, in New York, is that they recognized a guild. It's the guild that's backed by the machinists, which is the longtime labor union that represents black car drivers. And the machinists formed the Independent Drivers Guild, which is not a union, because legally it cannot be. People who are independent contractors can't actually join a union based on labor law. Even labor law, much like our safety net, was written for a different moment in time and a different economy. And so Uber recognized the Independent Drivers Guild, and the idea is Uber will pay the Independent Drivers Guild money in order for the Independent Drivers Guild to offer benefits and protections to its members. And so I think that's a really interesting model of both worker voice, in that these drivers are collectively part of an organization that advocates on their behalf. They don't have to do it alone, because for sure a driver writing Uber about a grievance that happened is going to just go, probably into the pile with hundreds of thousands of other grievances. But if an organization that represents hundreds of thousands of drivers is able to take that and play even an arbitration role, then I think it's a real step forward in what the future of worker voice looks like, alongside what the future of the safety net looks like, with benefits and protections being offered by a guild and offset by the company that is making the profits. So I think that's a really interesting move for Uber, one that I'm watching closely. They're also experimenting with a form of workers' comp in several states, where they will kick in a certain amount per mile if the driver matches it. And then that driver is covered with a version of workers' comp. So that's an experiment that they're running that I do think is important to note, because it's them putting money into it, not just passing some third-party product through to drivers to voluntarily opt into.
Okay, so we're fleshing out this portable benefits package thing. You've touched now a little bit on labor law or organizing and stuff as a kind of a secondary bucket. Is there any other thoughts on that space? Because I like your way of thinking about it. Hey, in the 20th century, over a long period of time, a lot of struggles, there was this kind of system that got built that everyone pretty much agreed to all across the spectrum, from business owners to workers to different parties. I mean, boom, it was a system. There was a little arguing around it, but in general, it was accepted. So we're trying to figure out what's that thing in the 21st century. We got the benefits piece, labor piece. I mean, as soon as you start saying that, it starts to get a lot of people. Well, there's certain progressive folks that gets them energized when you talk unions, and then there's others that get really upset about that. Is there a 21st century versions of things in there that are kind of work better for everybody kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I would say a couple of things. One is that the future of worker voice is also the future of our democracy. I fundamentally believe that. History has proven that to be true, and it's true in every other industrialized nation. That if there is nothing to balance the power, then the power moves unchecked, and the future of work will be dystopian. if it is we often talk in these conversations about those glorious days where manufacturing jobs throughout, middle America built an American middle class, mostly for white men, which is true. But there were, in fact, those jobs created. Those jobs were not inherently good jobs. If you remember in the beginning of the manufacturing boom, it was immigrants, newly arrived immigrants. It was children working in factories. The conditions were terrible. The pay was terrible. And it was only because people organized and organized for better workplaces that we ended up with the safety net that we are now trying to figure out what the 21st century version of looks like. That we had, 50 to 80 years of a workforce that had a pension, that had, safety standards that were built into law that people had to adhere to, that, had benefits and protections, and that had wage guarantees. None of that was preordained. None of that was true in the beginning of manufacturing. So I believe that just like we made sure children don't work in the factories and that we have weekends, that we can do that for the 21st century. We can figure out what the rules of work are, but it's going to require government, it's going to require industry, and it's going to require some form of worker voice at the table, making sure that is something it's a priority for everyone. It's interesting to think about historians will trace back the beginning of the safety net that employers administer to something called the Treaty of Detroit, which was when the big three automakers sat down with the big three labor unions and agreed that it wasn't going to flow through the government, it was going to flow through employers. And that set the course for what became law and what became the way we think of as an employer-administered work. So it may be that we need a treaty of the Treaty of Silicon Valley or something that says, here's what it looks like for the 21st century. And frankly, I think it's very likely government will play a much bigger role in that, sort of to the question you were asking earlier, is it the platforms or is it government? I think it could be both. It may be that we enter into a moment where we say, actually, if people have individual accounts, it's the government that should support that so that the fluidity in the workforce, can happen, so that we aren't putting all our eggs in one basket like Uber, if Uber is actually going to implode. Like none of, like we've seen over the last few months, that would have been unfathomable to think about even just a few years ago. That may be the best way to protect workers in a very dynamic, changing, labor force.
Safety standards, that's an interesting one. Because in our future sharing series, there's essentially what was a safe hotel room with, sprinkler systems or something was built up over the years, but what's the safety standards for, a room that you're renting in your house? Or the same thing like food standards, if you're sharing things out of, neighborhoods and out of your back kitchen, what's going to guarantee that where's the safety inspector from the old restaurant thing? So yeah, I'm curious, is there kind of a new thinking in safety, oversight, anything in those spaces, in these kind of independent worker spaces?
I think the future of safety standards, anti-discrimination laws, wages, like what is a minimum wage if one is not paid hourly, and privacy, like data privacy, those are all things that will have to be figured out soon. I actually think there's early thinking on it, but there's very little outside of the platforms themselves having sort of their own set of criteria that protects workers. So because the question is safety law was built when there was a clear employer. I go to my place of work, and there are a set of standards that employer has to meet. But if it's not clear who your employer is, then it's not clear who actually is responsible for the safety standards or anti-discrimination laws. So if you just use the case of a platform, if Uber is simply the intermediary and I am hiring you, the driver, am I the employer? Am I then responsible for your car's safety standards or to make sure that, I can't discriminate against you? So it's really an important question that's going to have to be answered. And I think as independent work grows, the importance of answering that question grows as well.
So, gosh, there's just so many buckets here. So the portable benefits thing, you did a lot of work, it's working. But boy, as we teed up here, we got safety standards, anti-discrimination, wages, minimum wages, although there's a lot of work around that. But the thing is, wages in independent contracting is different because you bid on, I'm going to do that logo for you.
Yeah.
And you could be working for a nickel an hour in the end. But,
yeah, right. I mean, Fiverr was built with the whole, like, what would someone do for $5? Which is pretty far below, what one would consider wage standards. But you're right. Minimum wage is built on an hourly construct, which makes sense, again, in an industrial context and in a retail context, and makes much less sense when you're imagining, both independent contracting and gig work, which is done more based on transactions and seconds and minutes and mileage than an hour. So,
and say more about the privacy thing. I mean, I could interpret what you're saying there, but as it applies to independent workers, say more about what you're saying needs to be fleshed out there.
Well, who owns the data? Who owns the data? So if I am doing a bunch of work on a platform, I am contributing to the overall network effect success of that platform. But when I leave, I don't really take any of it with me. And how much am I willing to share with the company, share with the world? All of that I think is pretty murky in most instances. So I think that'll be a big question. The one piece of it is the portability of data. If I'm building up my CV, my resume, on a series of platforms, but all of the work I've done simply lives on those platforms, like how can it be something I take with me to say, look, I'm a 5-star rated Postmates delivery person. That should mean something when I go apply at Instacart. But right now, it's sort of, I have to tell you that. There's no way in which I can port my data over.
In these spaces, is it safe to say there's at least some experimentation, some innovation, or is it some of these just really open fields? It's virgin territory now.
I think it's pretty open field on a lot of this. I think where you do see some experimentation is around worker voice. And so we've touched on this. And by that I mean, what will the labor union look like for the 21st century? The labor unions of the past were built around very specific sectors, very specific geographies, very specific employers. The collective bargaining is done with the employer to the union representing the workers. If all of that's blown up, geographies are different, sectors are different, there is no employer, what does the voice, the form of worker voice look like? And so I think there are some noteworthy experiments in this space. One is coworker.org, which is a platform taking the change.org type technology directly to the workplace and allowing employees or folks who work on a platform to connect with one another. So an example is inside of the W-2 space, but still a useful example, is Starbucks. So a Starbucks barista started a campaign that said, we think tattoos should be visible in the workplace. It's like a hardship for us to cover them up, and it doesn't make sense. It's like, 2017. And that campaign went viral among Starbucks employees through Facebook, through Twitter, like people's own networks and connections. And 60,000 baristas joined, and Starbucks said, okay, you're right. That is a dumb law. Let's change that rule. You can have tattoos in the workplace. I'm sorry, that's a rule. Yeah. You can have tattoos in the workplace. But what's interesting is that those 60,000 baristas are still connected to one another digitally. And they've continued to work on things that were important to them, like wages. And so you start to see the beginning of what a union might look like for the 21st century. It's not an official union. It's very disaggregated. It's not bound by specific geographies. They're connected through Facebook, but they sit down with the company and talk about what's important to the employees, and have frankly surfaced a bunch of things that are really important to the company too, like what it means when Starbucks doesn't have a full staff when they're short a few baristas, how hard it is on the baristas, but frankly, how much the customers hate it. And so there's a synergy developing, that I think is an important signal of what the worker voice could look like in the future.
When you talk about the interaction with the company, are there leaders, or how do you get 60,000 people to interact with the company?
Yeah, the folks who run it, a woman named Michelle Miller and Jess Kutch, who both come out of the labor movement as well as spent some time at change.org and have experience with technology, have been experimenting with some really interesting leadership development tools that help surface kind of who is ready to take leadership in a distributed scenario like that.
It's interesting. You just mentioned leadership development, and they're just ballooning here. So training, like, it's another thing that used to happen in the old economy. It's pretty clear. For an employee, why not train them? You'll get something out of it. But who would train the independent worker? Is there any thinking on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is one of the things. Because the companies who contract with independent workers want to keep that status, like they don't want to be challenged in courts on that, they can't actually offer any training. It's not legal. They can't offer benefits or protections. Anything that looks like an employer, they don't want to do because they don't want to move into that space because we have such a clear binary. You're an employer or you're not. And so anything that an employer offers, the non-employers cannot. And that has led to a significant absence of any apprenticeships, on-the-job training, training opportunities, investment in workforces within the independent contractor space. But I should say, this is also a problem in the economy writ large. As we have moved from an industrial economy to a retail and service sector economy, so the vast majority of jobs are in the retail industry and in the service industry, those companies have also not invested in training for their workers. And so there's folks like Senator Warner at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative who are looking at ways in which we could incentivize companies to invest in their workers. So this feels like a problem writ large, not unique to the alternative workspace, but definitely a huge absence in the alternative workspace as well.
So, but if you're working at McDonald's, you are an employee, so there would be at least some rationale to invest in that, right?
Yeah, but they just don't.
They don't. Okay.
Yeah, it's like there's probably a number of reasons why they don't. But one of the ideas is, could you actually offer tax incentives for training workers, for having a company spend money to invest in their workforce? It's just one of the ideas bubbling up right now.
Which is what we're trying to sort out here in this project, which makes it an interesting project, trying to wrap your heads around all these pieces. Which brings us to your current work, which we haven't even touched on, which is universal basic income. So we've talked about all these pieces of this 20th century thing. Universal basic income, how would you position that as kind of the kind of, well, you tell me. How do you talk about it to somebody?
Well, for me, it was, if benefits and protections should be portable in the future, that income perhaps should be as well. And that everyone deserves the basics. They deserve paid time off. They deserve health insurance. They deserve, parental leave and unemployment insurance and workers' comp. I also believe everyone deserves income. That we live in an era where there's great economic prosperity. It's limited to a few, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's a choice we're making. And so I think of the universal basic income or a guaranteed income as a solution to that. It just basically says that no matter who you are or where you are, you receive a monthly income to support your life. No strings attached, spend it how you want, and that people know best what they need. So whether they spend it on childcare or education or going out to eat, that it's all good.
Say more about it, though. I mean, from someone who would be skeptical of this, is like talk about why that's empowering and liberating rather than kind of undermining your kind of drive to do things, or to go out to work, to go out and kind of improve the world, kind of stuff. That seems to me to be one person. That would be one reaction to that, would be to say, well, wait a minute, well, wouldn't everyone just sit around watching TV or something? I know that's.
Yeah. Well, I think the instability of Americans right now, the financial instability of Americans right now, is in a very almost unprecedented place, right? There's that statistic that says 53% of Americans do not have the savings to cover a $400 emergency bill. So if you were slapped with blowing through a stop sign, which in San Francisco is like, I think, a $400 ticket,
Okay.
you would not be able to pay it. And you would either not pay it and then it would balloon, or you would take out a loan, and probably the only thing you'd have available to you is a very high interest rate loan, or you'd borrow it from a friend. I mean, it would just be a lot of work. And that instability is, to me, one of the things that I think are the most important things we solve for the 21st century. And I think a basic income monthly is the kind of thing that would help with that would give people income supports to, live their life. Studies show that when people have more income, that they are less stressed. Education, often they'll choose education because they're able to make a long-term decision in their life when there's some steady income. Or they'll take on something entrepreneurial. A lot of the Give Directly is a nonprofit that has been doing experiments around cash transfers in Africa for a very long time. And a lot of their studies show that there's an explosion in entrepreneurial activity when people have their basic needs met and a bit of capital infusion. So in that way, one could imagine it sort of the ultimate seed fund, like entrepreneurs have here in Silicon Valley, to be able to take a risk and start something new, go without a paycheck for a bit to invest in their future. The other way to think about it is it's like the ultimate strike fund, the ability for a worker to say, I don't want to do this job. I know that I have a monthly income, so this job is hard. It's not safe. I don't like it. I'm gonna step out of it and go do something else that I like more. And so in that way, sort of an ultimate strike fund is a way of thinking about it.
So just for people who are not familiar with it, it's not like a crazy amount of money, but it's a baseline thing that most people, you would argue, would build off of and continue to work, but use it as a platform to do more things, whether it's entrepreneurial or education-wise, or just bring in more money to what you're doing. That's exactly what I think about it. So it's not like everyone's just sitting around and could do whatever they want now, but it is at least a reliable thing that really does raise a platform or put a floor.
That's right. It's an income floor that says we as Americans are guaranteed an income floor of X amount. That's coming in each month, and then you build on top of that. It's sort of like if you got an allowance from your parents, or if you were playing the game of Monopoly. Every time you pass go, you get $200 just for passing go. And it's actually really important to that game dynamic that people have money. And that's where I think of this as, actually this week the Roosevelt Institute put out a very important paper that said a universal basic income would have a significant impact on growing the economy, that there would be more money in circulation, that you would see about a 12% growth in the economy, which is a very big deal. Because, there's a lot of people who argue that actually you'd see that there could be very disastrous effects to giving people money. But it's not the way it works in Monopoly. And now economists at the Roosevelt Institute have said that's probably not the way it'd work in the economy either. This is the kind of thing the Economic Security Project has funded. We believe there should be more research in the world, more advocacy, and more cultural engagement around the questions of cash in the U.S. context. A lot of the work has been done internationally. A lot has been done here, but not recently. And so that's why we think, the macro work that the Roosevelt Institute and others are doing is just really important to today's debate.
Okay, so the only other thing about that, again, for someone trying to wrap their heads around this for the first time, is so it's seen as a floor. It liberates people and energizes them as much as it would undermine their desire to work, at least from what we've seen in the past.
That's what the studies show.
And it's not also from a cost point of view. It's a workable cost, would you say, if you ever got a universal system going in the States?
Like everything in the United States, we are incredibly economically prosperous. It is all a decision we make on where the money goes and how we distribute it. So I believe it's not a question of the money, it's just a question of political will. However, it is a large amount of money, especially if you were to do the sort of purest version of $1,000 a month, then it gets to be a significant chunk of the GDP. And so that there is a lot of work to be done on, what are the right ways of capturing those resources and to fund a universal basic income. But let me tell you the story of the way they do it in Alaska, because in some ways we think of this as like a very exotic idea that is, could be very hard in America. We actually have two American versions, I would argue. One is Social Security. So my mother just went on Social Security this year. That is a monthly check that has meant she could quit her job and she could, be a caregiver for her grandson and do a bunch of things with her church that she'd been wanting to do, all of which I think are very valuable to society. And she now has the economic freedom to do it. So for anyone above 65, they know the basic income that comes monthly through Social Security is really important. The other place is in Alaska. So for the past 40 years, we've had in Alaska a Republican governor set up basically a sovereign wealth fund and took all the oil royalties as oil companies came in to drill in Alaska, took the royalties and put it into a fund that every Alaskan resident owns. And for 40 years, each year, the dividends of that fund get distributed among all Alaskans, debited directly into their account. It's yearly. It's between $1,000 and $3,000. It is very popular in a bipartisan way. So to the point where during the economic crisis, Governor Sarah Palin actually increased the amount that went to Alaskan residents, knowing that it was an important lifeline for many people. And what's important there is that it's money they didn't have to work for. They don't see it as a handout. They see it as an income supplement to whatever it is that they do in their livelihood. And we just did a bunch of research up there with the Omidyar Network to look at how do people spend the money. And it turns out they save for their children's education. They pay for heating throughout the very cold winter. They'll buy something like, they'll upgrade their car, which they need in transportation to and from their job. So, people use the money in very logical ways. And so I think that's also an important answer to people who worry about how folks would use the money that, we have 40 years worth of data that shows that it's important to people's livelihoods.
And the funny thing about that is it's not a progressively distributed thing. It's like literally everybody. If you were like Bill Gates, you'd get your $1,000 a month kind of.
Well, the big idea is that yes, if you're Bill Gates, you get your $1,000 a month. But if you're Bill Gates, you've also probably paid significantly more in taxes in order to fund that $1,000 a month. So net, you're last. However, there's another way of thinking about it that Ro Khanna, the congressman here in Silicon Valley, has a bill federally that would triple the earned income tax credit, paid for by a very small tax on high frequency trading called the financial transaction tax. You can raise billions off of the trading that happens in Wall Street, and why not use that to expand the nation's most important anti-poverty policy, the earned income tax credit. And so that would be the kind of thing that is, if you make below a certain amount, you're eligible. And I still think a very useful way of thinking about the beginnings of a basic income in the United States.
You've made reference quite a few times, well, to other places around the country, but when you're here in California, how much is California, even Northern California here, taking leadership in some of the innovation of this kind of thing, or is it not? I mean, I'm just curious, how do you situate what's happening around us here?
In terms of the policy and in terms of this kind of rethinking all these ways forward, how much is going on here as opposed to the rest of the country?
Well, I think California has led the way in a couple fronts. One, when you just look at employment writ large, the fight for 15 and the $15 minimum wage was one of the most important gains that we've seen, I think, in my social change time. That was hundreds of millions of dollars in wage gains for low-wage workers. I think California played a very important role in moving that forward. I'd like to see us do more on our earned income tax credit. So alongside, the truth is that even if you make minimum wage, you still are generally on some vast majority of people who make minimum wage are still on some form of public assistance. It is not enough to pay for the basics of life. So while we have to continue to fight for higher wages, I also think thinking about income supports alongside that is really important. So California just instituted a state earned income tax credit. There's probably a couple dozen states that have their own, in addition to the federal version. And this year we made it available to independent contractors. So if you earn 1099 income, that will be matched to the state's earned income tax credit. It's still small. I think we could go much bigger, especially in a state as prosperous as California. And I don't know if you saw yesterday, Farhad Manjoo in the New York Times said that the politics among the tech powers that be are actually quite liberal. Like they believe that they should be paying higher taxes. The one exception is on regulation, which gets to your sharing economy conversation. But if that's true, if we have a consensus that higher taxes are important in order to build the society that we want to build, to make sure people don't sleep on the streets, to make sure that they have enough, for health insurance and the basics, and we believe a safety net is important for all types of work, then we should be the place, that's pioneering that. Right now there's a bunch of talk about it, but I hope in the next few years we'll see more action. I mean, it's true. It is definitely true that the electorate in California is ready. The voters are ready. So we'll see what shows up on the ballot. And we'll also see what the legislature can do, the assembly can do.
And that I did not see that article, which we can track down. But in general, the frame there was that the leadership and the tech kind of people in the tech industry are open to more taxes.
Yeah, it was a couple of Stanford professors who'd done a survey on the tech elite and their sense of politics, and that in general, people felt like they should and could be paying more in taxes to support a world in which they want to live. The main point was that the place they differ from traditional liberal thinking is on regulation.
True. Although in the regulation, to be fair about that one, is when you're reinventing systems right now, this is maybe not the time to totally lock into tight regulations at the very least.
Right.
Although to kind of force some change in there, I think is probably good. That'd be my own interesting thing to hit on that.
Like a sandbox in which you can innovate.
Yeah, because right now, I mean, as we just talked about, wow, do we need experimentation here before we lock down in the way to do it?
That's right.
Final thing, because we're kind of now talking time. For someone who's been tracking all this, it looks like a lot on the table. Oh my God, with some of the stuff we're just starting, some things that have interesting ideas, some things have to be prototyped. I mean, what do you think of this transition? Talk a little bit of the timetables here that in your own head of thinking about this. Is this something, I mean, depending on how you put your lens in the 20th century, from the 1900 early progressive era through post-war time, I mean, there's a long period of things. Now, I'm not saying we have to go through that same 100-year cycle, but clearly also this isn't going to happen in the next 4 years or something. So how do you talk about the period we're in here in terms of what's it going to take to get into this next system in a more robust and thorough way?
Well, I think that we will start to see, we have to be experimenting at the state and city level. In general, most things require a federal response. And so they have to inform that. And it's hard to imagine the makeup of today's Congress and today's situation in Washington, D.C. moving anything forward. So I like to think that we spend the next 2 years, 3 years with more experimentation at the city and state level that will inform candidates who are running in 2020. And if we're able to, get back to a place where we actually can move things federally, then that would be honestly probably our best case scenario. But what scares me about that, because then if you're actually waiting till 2024 or so on, is that the levels of inequality are fast approaching depression levels of inequality. And that means that people don't have the basics that they need. There's 2/3, according to a Brookings report, 2/3 of the American households today make less money than they did 10 years ago. Make less. Their take-home pay has gone down. And we know that's true across 40 years. In fact, that we've seen wage stagnation during a time of great economic prosperity. Anybody who's had their money invested in the stock market knows it's exploded. Wages have stayed the same, which means that the American worker has done worse and worse. And now we know over the past 10 years, even actually worse. It's not stayed the same, it's gone down for 2/3 of households. So that concerns me that it's not sustainable, that people can't and won't live like that, and we will see upheaval because of it. And so I think that I hope that that is a timeline that pushes lawmakers in DC, that pushes lawmakers and civil society in the states to say this is something we have to address now, not only for the future of work, but frankly for the future of democracy.
And you kind of prodded California a little bit there. Do you think in the next what's your expectation in the next 4 years here, let's say in this state? Do you foresee it kind of a real...
I think California has an incredible opportunity right now to say we are the generator of great wealth. We are creating incredible companies and innovation that frankly don't, that a very small number of people can now explode worldwide, right? There's 1 million Facebook users per Facebook engineer. That is a very different scenario than what you saw on the line in Detroit, of car customers to workers. Small numbers of people can produce great amounts of wealth, and that means we have to rethink policy. We have to rethink how jobs work, how incomes work, and I think California has a real opportunity to lead on that. To say, yeah, we are going to pay higher taxes, but we are going to make sure that everyone who, let's say, makes under $50,000 receives a cost of living boost. That they receive income into their account monthly to make sure that they can cover that $400 bill that might pop up, that inevitably will pop up here and there. That we have both a responsibility to do it, and because we have some of the greatest inequality levels in the United States, and the opportunity to do it, because we have titans of industry here who are, I believe, forward-thinking and socially responsible. And so there's really nothing holding us back from being a leader on solving inequality.
And so are you, kind of to finish up here, are you optimistic or pessimistic, or how would you kind of...
Yeah.
What's your, when you think about the daunting challenges, but at the same time all the potential and opportunity there, how do you feel about that? Where are you feeling?
I remain an optimist, in part because it's too hard to walk through life as a pessimist. I think that, we've done this before. We have rewritten the rules of work that built the entire, that built the American middle class. We've said children no to the factories. We've said we want a weekend. We've said these are minimum wage laws. None of that was preordained. Yep. It was through great struggle. Blood was shed. But those are now the norms for the way we think of work today. I believe we can do that again. It's just going to take a lot more, focus and energy than we have currently, but I believe it's possible, and it has to be possible. We have to rewrite the rules of work.
Couldn't agree more. And what a great place to actually end what's been a fascinating conversation. Really laid out the landscape of many of the challenges, but also a lot of nubs for big opportunities here in the next, 5 to 10 years. So that's a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.